The three key issues that we're currently addressing constantly, because we obviously need to focus. The first is, why are we in a state of disaster? So we're busy with a court case against the state of disaster for the simple reason it's completely unnecessary. All the legislative instruments to handle this crisis has been in government's hands for more than 15 years. They've just simply not used them. And the state of disaster was a bit of political theater to say, but now we're really going to do something. But what you're doing is you're giving unfettered power to people who have not succeeded in solving the problem. And from our perspective, that's like somebody driving down the street and hitting every single car on their way to the house, and they pull in, they go, I should get a Boeing. And then and then get in a plane. So that just doesn't make any sense. That's why we're fighting it. And what you would see is that every single piece of legislation or announcement that they've made does not refer to the state of disaster at all. So we were in this weird situation. We're in a state of disaster with government having the capability to create any regulation to solve the crisis, but everything they do, they just refer to the previous legislative instruments. So it's a bit of a situation we were in it's theater mostly, and completely unnecessary with massive risks, as we saw with COVID, when you give government that type of power. The second question would be, how close are we to a total blackout? Is it on its way? And the answer is, we are no closer than we were 10 years ago, and we're no closer than we were 20 years ago. A blackout, if you go through a historical list of blackouts happen due to transmission failure 99% of the time. It's almost never due to generation failure. And we've got several members at National Control who can tell you we're just as likely to hit a blackout at stage 0 as we are at stage 8, as we are at stage 16. Blackouts usually happen due to a natural disaster that trips a high voltage line. In the 1965 legendary blackout in the northeast of America, a tree fell on a high voltage line, and that had a cascading effect that put the whole grid out of service. But in South Africa, stage 8 doesn't mean we're closer to a blackout. In fact, it means we are further from it away, because that is managing the load on the grid. We can theoretically go to stage 34 before a generation blackout would happen at stage 35, when we've got no power left on the grid whatsoever. So if a blackout happens, it will be due to a transmission failure. And there are several fail-safe mechanisms on this transmission grid that will kick in before that. The one that we can mention is you've got a spontaneous low-frequency load shedding, which means they'll literally just drop whole provinces off the grid before we go to a blackout, and that happens automatically once the frequency drops below 48 hertz. You just drop a whole province, you drop a whole metro to maintain the stability of the grid. The second is that not every single, but several power stations in South Africa will automatically island themselves. So when the grid's frequency drops below a certain level, that power station disconnects from the grid, and it keeps its own frequency up, and it keeps on running, which means the restart isn't 6 days in that point. It's going to be a couple of hours if we're hitting that situation. But once again, as long as we're in load shedding, the risk of a blackout is really extremely low. It's the same. What would, however, cause a blackout is if we've got a tree falling on a high voltage line, if we've got a freak blizzard that freezes a pylon, or unfortunately, if somebody goes and blows up a pylon with one of these high voltage lines. So sabotage can also cause that. And in fact, from our perspective, the only way we're going to hit a blackout is if we've got several deliberate failures being done. I wish we could say that that is completely impossible in South Africa, but we've seen too much subterfuge in power stations to say that it's a negligible risk, but it's not something that should happen in normal operating capacity. And then the last question is, but we've now heard that the grid is at capacity. Where are we going to add new energy? And the answer is, it is true, the grid is actually at capacity for dispatching energy from the Northern Cape and to the rest of the country, because South Africa, our grid was designed with coal in mind, not with the sun in mind. And that means we've got a massive amount of high voltage lines from Mpumalanga to the rest of the country where the coal is situated. We do not have a lot of power, high voltage lines from the Northern Cape and parts of the Western Cape back into the country where the sun is at its best. So you've got Eskom that is desperately giving land lease agreements to people in Mpumalanga saying, please put up a solar farm here. You've already got a grid connection, which is extremely high voltage, and you can immediately transmit most of that power and sell it without waiting 18 months plus for a high voltage slot, like in the Northern Cape. So we are in capacity generating wise from the Northern Cape, but Mpumalanga still has a lot of space, and the projections that we've seen is your solar farm will be roughly 3% less efficient if you put it in Mpumalanga rather than the rest of the country. But once again, this is a strong argument for rooftop solar, which is by itself much more decentralized and dispersed.